Cold rain hammered against the glass windows of Ashwood Hall, blurring the thick pine forests of Galehaven, Vermont into a dark, moving wall. Maeve Sinclair stood inside the grand entryway, her boots dripping small puddles onto the white marble floor while the servants moved past her, without a single glance. Her wool coat smelled like a wet field, and the chill from the long carriage ride had settled deep into her bones, making her teeth click together every time she tried to breathe. She tightened her grip on her small cloth bag, watching the fire roar in the massive stone fireplace across the room, though none of its heat managed to reach her corner. For 2 years, she had avoided this house and the relatives who lived inside it, preferring the quiet poverty of her own small cottage down the valley. But her younger brother, Liam, needed a future, and Uncle Richard held the only key to the maritime engineering program in the city, a placement that would save them both from freezing when the winter snows finally closed the mountain passes. Maeve swallowed the lump of pride in her throat, squared her shoulders, and waited for someone to acknowledge she was alive. Aunt Beatrice appeared at the top of the stairs, her dark silk dress rustling loudly against the carved wooden railings as she stepped down into the hall. She did not open her arms or offer a greeting, choosing instead to stop 3 steps from the bottom so she could look down at Maeve with a pinched, critical expression. The scent of heavy lavender perfume and strong gin moved ahead of her, a thick mixture that made Maeve cough into the back of her hand. Beatrice glanced at the muddy water pooling around Maeve's feet, her mouth twitching into a hard, thin line that made her powdered cheeks look like cracked plaster. She adjusted the heavy lace cuffs at her wrists, her rings clicking together in the quiet room as the grandfather clock near the door struck 5 o'clock with a heavy, metallic thud. Maeve opened her mouth to speak, but her aunt raised a single finger, cutting her off before a single word could leave her lips. The roads were completely washed out near the southern fork, Maeve said anyway, voice sounding flat and dry against the high stone walls of the foyer. The driver had to pull the carriage out of a deep ditch twice, which is why I missed the afternoon tea. Beatrice let out a short, sharp breath through her nose, turning her back on Maeve before the sentence was even finished. Do try to clean yourself up before the dinner bell rings, because we have important guests arriving from the Northern Territory tonight, her aunt said over her shoulder. I will not have you ruining the carpets or making the family look like we harbor beggars from the hills. Go down to the dining room when the clock strikes 6, and make sure you keep your hands hidden so no one sees those dirty fingernails. Maeve watched her aunt walk away, her fingers curling into tight fists inside her pockets until her nails bit into her skin. When the heavy wooden doors to the dining hall finally swung open, a wall of heat and the thick smell of roasted meat and red wine rushed out to meet her. The room was massive, dominated by a long table covered in white cloth that stretched beneath 3 iron chandeliers holding dozens of burning wax candles. Uncle Richard sat at the very top, his face already red from drinking, surrounded by wealthy landholders and local politicians who laughed loudly at his jokes. Maeve walked inside quietly, her soft leather shoes making no sound on the edge of the floor as she searched for her seat among the glittering silver and glass. She walked past the center of the table where the expensive crystal bowls filled with autumn fruit were placed, moving lower and lower down the room. The quality of the tablecloth changed from fine linen to rough cotton, and the high-backed chairs disappeared, replaced by simple wooden stools. At the very end of the table, shoved against the swinging door that led to the kitchen, Maeve found a small, grease-stained card with her name written on it. The cold wind from the hallway rushed past her neck every time a servant carried out a heavy platter of food, making her shiver beneath her thin dress. She looked up the length of the room, realizing her aunt had placed her past the silver salt cellars, a clear sign to everyone that she did not belong to the family. Maeve felt a hot wave of anger rise from her chest to her face, making her ears burn as she looked at the empty plate in front of her. She wanted to turn around, walk back out into the freezing rain, and never look at these people again. But she pictured Liam sitting at their kitchen table, staring at his drawing books with no hope of ever leaving the valley, and she forced herself to sit down. The wooden stool groaned under her weight, and the cold draft from the kitchen door immediately made her shoulders stiffen as she folded her hands in her lap. To her right sat an elderly woman who was entirely deaf, who spent her time cutting a small piece of bread into tiny crumbs without looking up. No one else at the lower end of the table spoke to Maeve, and the people at the top were too busy drinking and talking about land prices to notice her. Maeve kept her eyes fixed on a tiny crack in the rim of her porcelain plate, tracing it over and over with her gaze to keep from looking at the feast. Her stomach twisted with a sharp ache of hunger as the servants carried plates of beef past her, ignoring her empty hands as if she were a ghost. She told herself that she only needed to endure this one night, get the signature for Liam, and then she could leave. The entire room suddenly grew quiet, not with a sudden silence, but with a slow dropping of voices that started at the main doors and moved down the table. The heavy laughter died away, replaced by a strange, heavy pressure in the air that made it difficult for Maeve to draw a full breath. Heads turned toward the entryway, and even Uncle Richard stood up from his chair, his red face turning slightly pale as he smoothed down his vest. Maeve did not look up at first, keeping her eyes on her plate, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees in a matter of seconds. She felt the hairs on her arms stand up, an instinctive alarm ringing in her mind that told her something dangerous had just walked into the room. The footsteps that entered were slow, heavy, and completely steady, moving with the confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath him. "Your presence is a great honor, Silas," Uncle Richard boomed, his voice shaking slightly despite his loud tone as he gestured toward the empty seat at his right hand. "We were worried the mountain storm would keep you in the north, but we kept the fire burning, and the wine poured just for you." Maeve finally raised her head, looking through the forest of tall silver candlesticks to see the man everyone was staring at. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a dark coat that looked black in the dim light. But it was his face and hair that made her breath catch. His hair was completely white, the color of fresh Mount Frost, falling in sharp lines around a face that was as pale as winter snow. His skin looked translucent under the candles, completely flawless and white, making his dark eyes look like 2 pieces of coal set into ice. He did not look at Uncle Richard, and he did not move toward the expensive chair that had been prepared for him at the head of the table. His pale, intelligent eyes scanned the long row of guests, looking past the diamonds, the silk ties, and the fake smiles of the town elites. His gaze moved down the table, past the salt cellars, until it locked directly onto Maeve sitting by the kitchen door. Maeve felt her heart hit her ribs like a trapped bird, her breath stopping in her throat as those cold eyes held her own. She wanted to look away, to hide behind the deaf woman next to her, but she was completely frozen by the intensity of his look. Silas stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, the white hair framing his pale face, giving him the appearance of a winter ghost, before he reached out a pale hand. Silas gripped the top of the heavy mahogany chair that had been set for him next to Uncle Richard, his pale fingers contrasting sharply with the dark wood. He did not look at the footman who rushed forward to help him, nor did he offer any word of explanation to the waiting hosts. With a single smooth pull, he dragged the heavy chair away from the top of the table, the wooden legs striking the floor with a loud scrape. The sound was incredibly harsh, cutting through the polite silence of the room like a physical blow, and causing several elderly women to jump in their seats. Silas did not lift the chair. He simply walked down the length of the room, dragging the heavy wood behind him across the floorboards. The entire dining hall watched in absolute shock as the white-haired man moved past the wealthy guests, his expression completely blank. Scrape, thud, scrape. The heavy legs of the chair left light marks on the dark wood of the floor as Silas walked past the centerpieces and the silver platters. Uncle Richard stood with his mouth open, his hand still holding his wineglass in the air, completely unable to speak as his guest of honor walked away. Aunt Beatrice gripped her napkin so tightly, her knuckles turned white under her powder, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and panic. Maeve sat perfectly still on her wooden stool, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound of the chair grew louder and louder. She closed her eyes for a second, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole, because she knew exactly where he was going. When she opened her eyes, The dark coat was right next to her, blocking out the light from the nearest chandelier. Silas stopped right at the edge of the rough cotton tablecloth, looking down at the narrow space between Maeve and the deaf woman. Without asking for permission, he shoved his heavy mahogany chair into the small gap, forcing the deaf woman's stool a few inches to the side with a sharp screech. He then sat down, the wood groaning under his weight as his broad shoulder brushed lightly against Maeve's sleeve. The skin of his face was so pale it seemed to glow in the dim corner, and a strange scent of cold wind and winter pine washed over her. He was so close that Maeve could feel no heat coming from him, only a stillness that felt like the deep woods in January. Silas reached out, took a piece of bread from the small basket, and split it in two with his long fingers. "Pass the butter," Silas said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was meant only for her ear, though the silence in the room made it carry. Maeve's hand shook as she reached for the small porcelain dish, the silver knife clattering against the edge before she could grip it properly. She hated herself for showing weakness, but the sheer presence of the white-haired man next to her was completely overwhelming. She pushed the dish toward him, keeping her eyes down so she would not have to look at his snow-pale face or his dark eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, his tone completely ordinary, as if he sat at the lowest end of a dining hall every night of his life. Around them, 60 pairs of eyes were fixed on their corner, no one eating or speaking as the tension stretched tight. "What are you doing?" Maeve hissed under her breath, leaning slightly toward him so her aunt would not hear her voice across the room. "You are making a scene, and you are dragging me right into the middle of it, as if this were some kind of joke. I was already humiliated enough by being placed down here by the kitchen, and now you have made sure everyone is staring at me." Silas took a slow bite of the bread, chewing deliberately before he turned his head to look at her fully. His pale gray eyes were completely clear, showing no sign of pity or amusement, which surprised her more than his actions. "I did not move down here for your benefit," he said bluntly, his voice steady and calm. Maeve felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, her shoulders pulling inward as she shrank back onto her stool. She felt entirely foolish for thinking a powerful man from the northern peaks would care about her placement at a dinner table. "I moved," Silas continued, his gaze drifting up the long table to where Uncle Richard sat watching them with a terrified expression, "because I refused to sit next to a pig. Your uncle spent the last 3 months selling the grain reserves of his tenant farmers to the logging companies while the village children went hungry. He is a coward who smells of cheap gin, and his wife's perfume is currently giving me a severe headache, so I prefer the air down here." A short, breathless laugh escaped Maeve's throat before she could stop it, and she quickly clapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The sound was lost as the kitchen door suddenly swung open, and a terrified footman emerged carrying a massive silver bowl of hot soup. The servant nearly ran into the back of Silas's chair, his eyes bulging out of his head as he looked from the white-haired man to the empty space at the top of the table. "Right here," Silas said, tapping the rough cotton cloth in front of him with a single finger. "I believe we have been waiting for the first course for 20 minutes, and the service down here is quite slow." The footman, his hands shaking so violently that the silver ladle clicked against the bowl, quickly filled Silas's plate with steaming broth. He then turned to Maeve, hesitating for a second, because Aunt Beatrice had given strict orders to skip her during the main courses. Silas did not say a word, but he turned his dark eyes toward the servant, his pale face hardening into a look of absolute cold authority. The footman turned white, instantly dropping his gaze, and hurried to fill Maeve's bowl, spilling a few hot drops onto the cloth in his rush. He practically sprinted back through the swinging door, leaving the two of them alone with their soup, while the rest of the table remained silent. Maeve picked up her small silver spoon, her hands finally stopping their shaking as she looked at the hot food. The soup was hot and thick, and as Maeve took a small sip, the cold knot of hunger in her stomach began to loosen. She kept her eyes on the plate, feeling the heavy weight of her aunt's glare from across the room, a silent promise of punishment that she knew would come tomorrow. "They will make me pay for this," Maeve said quietly, her voice barely louder than the sound of the rain outside the window. "Tomorrow morning, When your carriage leaves for the northern mountains, I will be the one left here to deal with their anger. My aunt has a very long memory for embarrassment, and she will ensure my life is miserable for what you just did." Silas did not look up from his plate, using his fork to move a piece of meat with absolute precision. "Let them try," Silas said, his voice low and flat, carrying a dangerous edge that made the words sound like a statement of fact, rather than a boast. "You do not understand how things work in this house," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the handle of her silver spoon until it hurt. "I need my uncle's signature for my brother Liam's placement at the academy, and I have to swallow their insults because we have nothing else. You are a powerful man who can do whatever he wants, but I have to live in the real world where poor relations have no choices." She expected him to tell her to be brave, or to offer some empty words about standing up for herself, but he simply stopped eating. He set his utensils down on the plate with a small click, turning his broad frame toward her so that he completely blocked her from the view of the rest of the room. "Where does your brother wish to study?" Silas asked, his pale face serious as he watched her reaction. "The Naval Engineering School in the city," Maeve replied, thrown off by the sudden change in his question. "He wants to work under Director Vance, but the application requires a letter from a local landowner to prove our family's standing." Silas nodded slowly, his white hair catching the light of the candles as he leaned back slightly. "Vance owes me 3 favors from the winter before last, when I cleared the northern trade routes for his supply ships." Maeve stared at his pale profile, her heart skipping a beat as she tried to understand what he was implying. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I am saying that you do not need your uncle's pen, and you certainly do not need to sit by a kitchen door to beg for scraps," Silas murmured. He looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time Maeve noticed that his pupils were completely black, surrounded by a ring of silver. The cold air from the kitchen door blew across her neck again, but she no longer felt the chill, her entire attention locked onto the white-haired man beside her. He was not smiling, and there was no softness in his expression, but his words felt more solid than anything else in the house. At the top of the table, Uncle Richard finally found his courage, clearing his throat loudly as he tried to regain control of his dinner party. "Your presence is required up here, Silas," Richard called out, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of trying to sound important. "Surely you would be much more comfortable in the proper chair, away from the draft of the servant's door." The entire room held its breath, waiting to see how the powerful man from the north would respond to the direct request. Silas did not raise his voice, nor did he look up from his plate as he picked up his heavy glass of wine. "I am perfectly comfortable right here, Richard," Silas said, his low voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room, his tone filled with absolute contempt. "The company at this end of the table is infinitely superior to what you have gathered at the top." A collective gasp moved down the row of guests, and Aunt Beatrice looked as though she might actually faint into her soup bowl. Maeve felt a tight, painful knot in her chest finally break open, a small feeling of victory rising within her as she raised her own glass. The wine was cheap and sour, but as she took a slow sip, it tasted like the best thing she had ever had. The dinner finally ended, leaving the dining room filled with a strained, uncomfortable murmur as the men remained at the table with their drinks. Maeve followed the line of wealthy women into the large parlor, where a massive wood fire was burning in the stone hearth, making the air thick and hot. She retreated to the darkest corner of the room, standing near a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of old dust, wishing she could disappear into the shadows. The other women clustered in tight circles near the fire, whispering behind their hands while casting sharp glances in her direction. Maeve kept her hands folded in front of her, watching the flames dance while she waited for the evening to end so she could go to bed. Aunt Beatrice detached herself from a group of local ladies and walked across the room, her dark silk skirts sweeping along the floor like a snake in the grass. Her face was a mask of white powder and red splotches of anger, her eyes fixed on Maeve with a look of pure hatred. She stopped inches from Maeve, her hot breath smelling of gin and sweet lavender as she leaned in close to speak in a harsh whisper. "You little viper," Beatrice hissed, her teeth clenched so tightly that her jaw looked rigid under her skin. "Do you think I am blind to your cheap tricks, playing the quiet orphan, to get the attention of the Northern King? You have ruined my dinner party, and embarrassed your uncle in front of every important family in the county." "I did nothing but sit where you told me to sit," Maeve said, keeping her voice steady, despite the cold panic that started to rise in her throat. "The king chose to move his own chair, and I had no part in his decision, so you cannot blame me for his actions." Beatrice sneered, her fingers digging into the fabric of her own fan until the wood creaked under the pressure. "He will be gone by noon tomorrow, and when his carriage leaves our gates, you will be nothing but dirt under my shoes again," her aunt whispered. "Your brother will never see that school, because Richard will burn his application before the postboy arrives, and I will see you both thrown into the mud." Maeve stood perfectly still, refusing to let her aunt see the tears that were pricking the corners of her eyes, remembering the steady look of the white-haired man. She did not offer an apology, nor did she look down at the floor, forcing herself to meet her aunt's hateful gaze until the older woman finally turned away. Beatrice marched back toward the fire, leaving Maeve alone in the shadow of the velvet curtain, with her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She stayed in the corner for another hour, listening to the empty chatter of the wealthy women until the clock finally struck 10. She slipped out of the room unnoticed, climbing the narrow wooden stairs to her small attic room at the very top of the house. The room was freezing, the wind rattling the loose glass in the single window and keeping the air as cold as ice. Maeve did not take off her clothes, choosing instead to wrap herself in a thin wool blanket as she lay down on the narrow cot. She lay awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling while she listened to the storm howl through the pine trees outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the translucent skin and the silver eyes of Silas, wondering what kind of man could terrify her uncle with a single look. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering from the cold that seemed to come from the walls themselves, praying that the morning would bring an answer. The sun rose behind a thick layer of gray clouds, casting a pale, cold light over the muddy grounds of Ashwood Hall when the clock struck 6. Maeve rose from her cot, her body stiff from the cold room and her mind exhausted from a night without sleep. She wrapped her old wool shawl around her shoulders and slipped down the back stairs, wanting to escape the heavy atmosphere of the house before her aunt woke up. The grand hallways were quiet and empty, the fires not yet lit, and the air smelling of cold wax and old tobacco smoke. She let herself out through the kitchen door, walking quickly through the wet grass toward the large wooden stables at the back of the property. The air inside the stables was instantly warmer, filled with the rich, heavy scent of fresh hay, dry earth, and warm horses. Maeve walked down the central aisle, letting her fingers trail along the rough wood of the stall doors as the sound of horses chewing oats brought a sense of calm to her mind. She stopped near a large brown mare, leaning her head against the wooden bars and closing her eyes to enjoy the peace of the quiet morning. "She bites if you crowd her," a low, rough voice said from the shadows, causing Maeve to jump back with a sharp gasp. Silas was standing 3 stalls down, holding a wooden brush in his hand as he looked at her through the dim light. He was not dressed in his fine coat, wearing instead a simple white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His skin looked even whiter in the morning light, almost like carved marble against the dark wood of the horse stall, and his white hair was tied back with a leather strip. He was grooming a massive black stallion that snorted and stomped its foot, though the animal remained perfectly still under the touch of Silas's pale fingers. "Your Grace," Maeve stammered, her cheeks turning red as she took a step back down the aisle. "I apologize. I did not know anyone was awake at this hour, and I did not mean to intrude on your time." Silas tossed the brush into a wooden bucket, the sound loud in the quiet stable, and wiped his hands on a clean cloth. "The horses do not care about the hours of the house, and neither do I," he said, leaning against the stall door to study her face with his dark eyes. "You look terrible, Maeve," he stated bluntly, his tone without any politeness as he noted the dark circles under her eyes and her pale skin. A short, genuine laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it, her shoulders relaxing slightly under his direct words. "Your compliments are truly wonderful. Your Grace," she replied, a small smile touching her lips for the first time all morning. "Silas," he corrected roughly, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a serious expression. "If we are going to plan against your relatives, you might as well use my name instead of titles." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick piece of folded paper, sealed with a heavy layer of dark red wax. He held it out to her, the white of his hand making the dark wax look like a drop of fresh blood in the bright shadows of the stable. Maeve took a slow step forward, her heart skipping a beat as she looked at the paper that held her brother's entire future. "This is a direct letter to Director Vance," Silas explained as her fingers closed around the heavy parchment. "Liam is to present himself at the city office on the first day of next month, and his place in the program is guaranteed under my name." Maeve clutched the letter to her chest, her eyes burning with tears that she refused to let fall as a massive weight left her shoulders. "I do not know how to repay you for this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have nothing to give a man of your position, and we are strangers." "I told you the price last night," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floor of the stable. "Watching your uncle turn white was worth the effort, and the debt is completely settled between us, so do not speak of repayment." "Your aunt told me last night that you would be gone by noon," Maeve said, the words spilling out before she could think to stop them. She said, "Uncle Richard would burn the papers and throw us into the mud the moment your carriage cleared the front gates." Silas's face went completely still, his eyes turning cold and dark, as he stared at the stable wall for a long moment, a small muscle jumping in his jaw. "Plans have changed," he said flatly, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made the horses in the stalls shift uneasily. "The mountain roads are completely ruined by the storm, and it would be highly irresponsible of me to risk my horses in such deep mud. I believe I will be forced to stay at Ashwood Hall for another 5 days, perhaps a full week, until the ground dries out." Maeve looked at him, realizing the excuse was a complete lie designed to keep her relatives from touching her while she remained in the house. "Uncle Richard will know the roads are fine," she said quietly. "Let him know," Silas replied, a small, cold light appearing in his silver eyes. "What is he going to do about it? Turn a king out into the rain. Take the letter to the postboy down the road yourself. Hide it from your aunt, and stay in the main parts of the house where they cannot touch you." When Maeve walked into the entryway of the main house, she found Uncle Richard standing near the grand staircase, wearing a bright silk robe that made his red face look even darker. He marched toward her, his slippers slapping loudly against the marble floor, as he pointed a thick finger directly at her face, his breath smelling of stale alcohol. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high stone walls and causing a passing maid to drop her dusting cloth in fear. "Your aunt spent the entire night with a severe headache because of your behavior yesterday, and you will go to her room right now to beg for her forgiveness." "I have nothing to be sorry for, Uncle," Maeve said, standing straight and keeping her arms flat at her sides, refusing to shrink away from him as she had done for the past 2 years. Richard's eyes bulged with anger, his hand shaking as he stepped closer to her, his shadow covering her completely in the dim hallway. "You will do exactly as I say, or I will see to it that your brother spends the rest of his life working in the coal mines down the river," he hissed. "I will ruin both of you before the sun sets today, and no one in this county will ever give you a single dollar of work." "You will not be writing to anyone, Richard," a cold voice said from the front door, causing the older man to spin around so fast he nearly tripped over his own robe. Silas walked into the hall, his muddy boots leaving dark tracks on the clean marble floor as he carried a short riding crop loosely in his hand. He did not look angry, but his white hair and pale skin gave him an unearthly appearance that made Uncle Richard instantly take 2 steps back. Silas stepped between them, his broad shoulders completely blocking Maeve from her uncle's view as he tapped the crop against his leg with a sharp click. "I found a major problem with my carriage axle this morning," Silas said smoothly, his dark eyes fixed on Richard's shaking frame. "It seems I must accept your hospitality for a few more days while my men perform the necessary repairs to the wheels." Richard swallowed hard, his face turning a pasty white as his anger disappeared. replaced by a deep panic that made his hands shake within his large sleeves. "Of course, it is an honor, Your Grace, but this girl requires family discipline," Richard spluttered, gesturing weakly toward Maeve. "I find family discipline incredibly boring, Richard," Silas said softly, the low tone of his voice carrying a threat that made the older man completely still. "What I do find interesting is a report from the northern town regarding the missing funds from the timber tax, a tax that I believe you manage for the county." The remaining color left Richard's face, leaving him looking like a ghost as he closed his mouth and lowered his hand to his side. "While I am here, I expect this house to be quiet, and Miss Sinclair will take her meals at the main table, away from the kitchen doors," Silas added. The next 3 days were filled with a quiet, heavy tension that settled over every room in Ashwood Hall like a thick blanket of winter fog. The rain continued to fall in a steady drizzle, keeping everyone trapped inside the stone walls where the only sound was the ticking of the clocks. Uncle Richard spent his hours locked in his private study with a bottle of brandy, refusing to come out even when the dinner bell rang across the house. Aunt Beatrice moved through the long corridors like a silent, heavily perfumed ghost, her dark eyes tracking Maeve with an expression of pure hatred that she did not dare put into words. But neither of them spoke a single harsh word to Maeve, completely stopped by the constant presence of the white-haired king, who seemed to be everywhere. Maeve spent her afternoons in the large library at the back of the house, the only room that smelled of old paper and wood smoke rather than wine and lavender. Silas joined her there every day after noon, taking a large leather chair by the fire where he would sit for hours without saying a word, a book resting in his pale hands. He did not try to talk to her or perform the duties of a guest, content to let the silence stretch between them as the fire burned down to red coals. It was a comfortable quiet, the understanding of two people who had no desire to pretend for the rest of the world, and Maeve found herself looking forward to those hours. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Silas closed his book with a soft thud, leaning forward to look at the large map of the Northern Territory that Maeve was studying. "Your uncle is a thief," he said bluntly, his low voice cutting through the quiet room and causing Maeve to look up from the paper. "I have been looking through the town land records that he keeps in the main desk, and he has been overcharging the local farmers for their winter wood by 40%. He takes their money to pay for his wife's silk dresses and his own losses at the card tables in the city, leaving the village families to freeze." Maeve set her pencil down, a cold feeling of disgust rising in her stomach as she looked at the fire dancing in the hearth. "I knew he was a hard man, but I did not realize he was breaking the law to line his own pockets," she said quietly. "He is not breaking the law," Silas corrected with a sharp, bitter edge to his voice as he stood up to walk toward the window. "The law belongs to the men who own the land, not the people who work the dirt, and it protects his right to be a parasite on the valley." He stood with his back to her, his white hair bright against the gray light of the window, his broad shoulders rigid with anger. "You care about them," Maeve observed softly, standing up from her desk and moving across the room until she was a few feet away from his long shadow. "More than you like to admit to anyone else, because you stayed in this house to stop him from hurting the people who cannot fight back against his power." Silas turned around to look at her, his pale face inches from her own, his dark eyes carrying a deep burning light that made her breath stop. "My own father was exactly like your uncle, except he had an entire northern kingdom to ruin instead of a small valley estate," Silas whispered, his voice a rough rasp. "He spent his life drinking and selling our forests to pay for his pleasures in the south, leaving our people to die of the winter cold when the roofs caved in," he continued. "When I took his place 5 years ago, the land was completely ruined, and I spent 3 years in the mud rebuilding the cabins with my own hands. I do not have a good heart, Maeve, but I have a violent hatred for men who break the things they are supposed to protect." Maeve looked at his pale face, feeling the intense truth of his words move through the space between them until she could no longer feel the chill of the room. Without thinking about the rules of the house, she reached out her hand and placed her fingers gently on his broad shoulder, feeling the hard, coiled muscle beneath the dark wool. Silas froze at her touch, his dark eyes dropping to her pale hand before he slowly raised his own hand to cover her fingers with his palm. His skin was completely cold, like ice from the mountain peaks, but his grip was firm and steady, anchoring her to the floor as they stood by the window. They remained like that for a long time, listening to the rain hit the glass, two cynical people who had found a strange, quiet understanding in the middle of a cruel house. The sun finally broke through the heavy clouds on the morning of the 6th day, casting long lines of bright gold light across the wet stone walls of Ashwood Hall. Maeve sat at the main breakfast table, spreading a small amount of fruit preserves onto her bread, while her aunt and uncle sat in complete silence at opposite ends. The atmosphere was broken when the front doors banged open, and a tall courier covered in mud from his long ride walked straight into the dining room without being announced. He moved past Uncle Richard, stopping next to Silas's chair to hand him a thick letter sealed with the official mark of the City Maritime Academy. Silas took the paper, breaking the black wax with his thumb before unfolding the large sheet to read the words written inside, with his sharp gray eyes. He did not smile, but he looked across the table at Maeve, his low voice carrying clearly through the silent room as he read the lines aloud. Liam Sinclair has been officially accepted into the Advanced Engineering Program, with orders to report to the city docks by the 12th day of this month, Silas read. The document is signed by Director Vance himself, and his placement cannot be changed by any local authority or landowner. Maeve closed her eyes, a long, shaking breath leaving her lungs as the invisible cage she had lived in for 2 years finally shattered into pieces. Liam was safe. His future was completely secure, and her uncle could no longer use her brother's name to force her into compliance with their demands. Richard looked down at his plate, his face a mixture of gray skin and dark purple veins as he realized his absolute control over Maeve was completely dead. Silas stood up from his chair, folding the paper and tossing it onto the table in front of Maeve before turning to his servant. "Prepare the horses," Silas ordered, his tone flat and businesslike as he looked toward the entryway of the house. "The roads are dry enough for travel, and we will leave for the northern peaks within the hour, so make sure the carriage is ready." Aunt Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her eyes turning toward Maeve with a sudden, predatory look that showed she was already planning her revenge for the moment the guest left. Maeve saw the look, realizing that while Liam was free, she was still trapped in this house with no money and nowhere to go once Silas departed. Silas did not wait for her aunt to speak, walking around the table until he stood directly behind Maeve's chair, his dark coat blocking the light from the large window. "Pack your things, Maeve," he said down to her, his voice calm and entirely steady, as if he were stating a simple fact about the weather. "This house is no longer a place for you, and Miss Sinclair will be leaving Galehaven in my carriage when we depart this morning." Beatrice slammed her hands onto the wood table, her powdered face shaking with anger as she stood up to confront the Northern King. "You cannot take her," her aunt shrieked, her voice high and sharp against the stone walls. "She is an unmarried woman under our care, and leaving with you will completely ruin her reputation in the county." "She is already ruined by living under the roof of a thief and a coward," Silas replied bluntly, his dark eyes turning toward the older woman until she shrank back. He looked down at Maeve, extending his pale, cold hand toward her with his palm facing upward in the bright morning light. "My estate in the north is very large. It is always freezing, and my head clerk is an old man who cannot manage the timber books to save his life," Silas said softly. "I need someone who knows how to find a thief, someone who does not mind the mountain mud, and my library is much larger than this one." Maeve looked at his white hand, realizing it was not a promise of soft words or poetry, but an offer of a real life built on respect and shared strength. She did not hesitate, placing her hand into his cold, firm grip as she stood up from her stool, leaving her past behind her in the quiet room. The shadow of Ashwood Hall fell away behind the carriage as the heavy wooden wheels turned onto the mountain road, moving steadily toward the high white peaks of the north. Maeve watched the dark stone chimneys disappear behind the thick pine trees, feeling no regret or sadness for the life she was leaving in the valley below. She rested her hand against the small leather pouch that held Liam's acceptance letter knowing that her brother was already packing his things for the city while she moved toward her own unknown future. The air inside the carriage was cool and quiet, filled only with the steady sound of the horse's hooves striking the dry dirt of the path. Silas sat across from her, his white hair bright against the dark leather of the seat, his pale face turned toward the window as the landscape changed from fields to gray rock. He did not offer any soft words or promises about what she would find at his northern estate, content to let her find her own peace in the long hours of the journey. Maeve looked down at her hands, noting that the frayed edges of her slate blue dress looked small against the expensive wool blankets he had provided for the ride. She knew the world would whisper about her choice, calling her a fool for leaving with a man everyone feared, but she had never felt more secure than she did in the presence of the white-haired king. As the carriage climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew sharp and thin, carrying the clean scent of early snow and deep stone that belonged to the high country. Maeve leaned her head against the glass, looking forward to the heavy ledgers, the cold rooms, and the quiet library that waited for her at the end of the road. She knew that life with Silas would not be a soft fairy tale, but it would be a real partnership built on truth, mud, and a shared hatred for the cruelty of the world below. For the first time in many years, she watched the sun set behind the white peaks with a steady heart, completely ready for whatever the winter would bring.